This is why freshwater stingrays are considered more dangerous than their ocean-dwelling relatives, and why the people who share rivers with them fear them more than piranhas. Roughly 37 species make up the family Potomatrigonidae, all of them found exclusively in the rivers of South America. And what separates them from every other stingray on the planet is not just their venom, but the way that venom actually works. To understand what sets these animals apart, we need to go back about 50 million years, because freshwater stingrays were never supposed to live in rivers at all. During the Eocene epoch, rising sea levels flooded massive portions of what we now call the Amazon basin, and marine stingrays rode that water inland. When the ocean eventually pulled back, those animals found themselves stranded in freshwater with no way to return. Adapt or disappear, those were the only two options. The survivors pulled off an extraordinary biological reversal, their kidneys completely switching function, so that instead of excreting salt the way marine rays do, they began retaining it. That single adaptation turned a saltwater animal into a permanent freshwater resident, and today Potomatrigonidae stands as the only family of rays on Earth almost entirely restricted to freshwater habitats. That evolutionary history matters because it sets up the central question of this video. These animals spent millions of years reshaping themselves for a completely different environment, and their venom reshaped right along with them. Which brings us to what actually happens when one of these rays stings you, and why it is so much worse than a sting from a marine species. Marine stingrays concentrate their venom-producing cells inside small grooves that run along the sides of the stinger. That is the full extent of the delivery system, just those narrow grooves. Freshwater stingrays took a different path entirely, spreading their venom-secreting cells across the entire surface of the stinger blade. The coverage area is dramatically larger, and the density of protein cells within that area is significantly higher, which means even a minor scratch from a freshwater ray's barb can push venom into the wound, while a deep puncture delivers a massive dose all at once. Marine stingrays simply cannot match that level of delivery with their more limited cell placement. The venom itself carries a different chemical profile as well. Research has identified it as principally composed of enzymes that trigger three main effects: intense pain, fluid accumulation in the tissue, and necrosis, which is the outright death of living cells. Specific peptides, including two called porphyrin and orpotrin, show up in the venom alongside various proteases, enzymes whose job is to break down proteins inside your body. And the clinical numbers back all of this up in ways that are hard to ignore. Out of 84 freshwater stingray injuries studied in Brazil, ulcers and tissue necrosis appeared in over 90% of cases. Those ulcers lasted roughly 3 months on average and frequently left permanent scars. Compare that to marine stingray injuries in the United States, where necrosis is rarely reported at all. The gap between the two could not be wider. Pain from a freshwater sting hits immediately, typically reaching peak intensity within 30 to 90 minutes and persisting for as long as 48 hours. And here is the part that catches most people off guard. No antivenom exists for freshwater stingray venom. None. Treatment remains limited to managing symptoms, controlling pain, and addressing the tissue damage as it unfolds. A study out of the Butantan Institute in São Paulo added yet another layer to what we know about this venom. Researchers Carla Lima and Monica Lopez Ferreira discovered that the composition and effects of freshwater stingray venom actually shift depending on the age and sex of the individual animal. Young rays produce venom overwhelmingly focused on causing pain, which likely serves as a defensive tool to frighten away predators. Adult rays produce something different entirely, venom geared toward causing necrosis, tissue destruction that helps them incapacitate small fish, shrimp, and crustaceans during hunting. Nobody had ever documented age and sex-dependent venom variation in any stingray species before this study, marine or freshwater. Previously, that kind of variation had only been observed in snakes. The findings appeared in the journal Toxicon, and they carry a real clinical implication, because if medical professionals can determine whether a victim encountered a small ray or a large one, they may be able to tailor the treatment to match. So the venom is more toxic, more efficiently delivered, and more variable than anyone previously understood. But the danger extends well beyond biochemistry because the behavior of these animals makes accidental encounters almost unavoidable for people living along South American rivers. Freshwater stingrays are bottom dwellers that bury themselves in sand or mud on the river floor, leaving nothing visible except their eyes. They are practically invisible, and their range covers virtually every major warm water river system across tropical South America, including the Amazon, the Orinoco, the Piranha, the Paraguay, and the Xingu, along with river systems running through Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, Guyana, Suriname, and Argentina. Anywhere there is warm, shallow, slow-moving freshwater in the tropics, there is a reasonable chance that stingrays are sitting just beneath the surface. None of these animals are aggressive. Their stingers exist strictly for self-defense. The problem is that self-defense gets triggered the moment someone steps on one, and by the time you feel it under your foot, the tail is already moving. A rapid reflex whips that tail upward, driving the stinger into the victim before there is any chance to react. The barb itself is mineralized, hard, and serrated, built to puncture and tear through skin, and it frequently breaks off inside the wound, requiring surgical removal. On top of the venom and the laceration, bacterial infections following the sting are extremely common, and some researchers believe these secondary infections may actually cause more long-term damage than the venom itself. When you combine a potent toxin, a deep serrated wound, barb fragments lodged in the tissue, and bacterial contamination from river water, the full picture of why these injuries can become devastating starts to come into focus. The injury numbers across South America tell that story clearly. Colombia alone reports more than 2,000 freshwater stingray injuries every single year. In the United States, where encounters involve almost exclusively marine species, stingray-related fatalities occur at a rate of roughly 1 to 2 per year. That number climbs to as many as 8 per year in South American nations dealing with Amazonian freshwater rays. And those figures only capture the reported cases. Surveys conducted among fishing communities suggest that up to 25% of people living near freshwater stingrays have been stung at some point, and many of those injuries happen in remote rural areas where victims turn to folk medicine rather than hospitals, which means the true scope of the problem almost certainly dwarfs the official records. Communities across the Amazon have long maintained that they fear the freshwater stingray more than the piranha. That claim appears repeatedly across scientific literature and field reports, and when you consider that freshwater stingray venom causes tissue necrosis in 9 out of 10 documented cases, the reasoning behind that fear becomes pretty difficult to argue with. What makes this picture even more complicated is that the very thing making these animals so dangerous is also part of what makes them so valuable. Freshwater stingrays rank among the most sought-after species in the global ornamental fish trade. A common species like the Piranhas motoro, the ocellate river stingray, might sell for a few $100s in the aquarium market. But the species collectors truly chase is the Piranhas leopoldi, the polka dot or black diamond stingray, found only in the Xingu River system of Brazil. Retail prices for a quality black diamond run anywhere from $1,200 to over $7,000 per fish. One individual freshwater stingray with an especially rare color pattern reportedly changed hands for $30,000. And at the extreme end of the collector market, a polka dot ray carrying a rare U-shaped body mutation has been offered by breeders in Singapore for $100,000 per specimen. Between 2010 and 2015, Brazil legally exported between roughly 4,600 and 5,700 freshwater stingrays per year, most of them P. leopoldi and P. wallacei. But the legal trade only tells part of the story. Global data covering 2017 through 2021 exposed a staggering gap, with exporting nations reporting around 127,000 individual stingrays traded, while importing nations reported fewer than 15,000. A discrepancy that large points to widespread underreporting, illegal smuggling, or some combination of both. All of that demand created a cycle that keeps feeding itself. Serious captive breeding efforts only got underway in the late 1990s after Brazil cracked down on wild-caught exports, and Southeast Asian fish farms, particularly in Indonesia and Thailand, now produce thousands of stingrays each year, including designer hybrids bred by crossing different species to create new patterns and colors. Wild collection continues alongside the captive market, and it has driven population declines in some species. What nobody anticipated was the invasive species problem. Freshwater stingrays have now established breeding populations outside of South America entirely. Researchers confirmed a reproducing population in the Piranhas River on Java, Indonesia, where 13 individuals, including newborns, were captured. A venomous South American predator now reproducing in Southeast Asian waterways. That situation is still developing, and the long-term consequences remain unclear. On the conservation front, a turning point arrived in November of 2022 at the CITES Conference of the Parties in Panama City, where Brazil proposed listing P. leopoldii and P. wallaceae under Appendix 2, a designation requiring both export and import permits for international trade. The proposal passed, and as of February 2023, 7 freshwater stingray species carry Appendix 2 protections: P. leopoldii, P. wallaceae, P. henley, P. djibouti, P. albimaculata, P. marquesi, and P. signata, with 5 additional lookalike species receiving coverage as well. Patricia Charvet, a researcher at Brazil's Federal University of Ceará, who spent decades pushing for those protections, described the moment the proposal passed as the best feeling in the world. But CITES only governs international trade. It does nothing to address habitat destruction from dam construction, agricultural expansion, deforestation, or mining operations. The Belo Monte hydroelectric dam on the Xingu River has already altered critical habitat for the endemic P. leopoldii, which the IUCN assessed as vulnerable in 2022. Across other waterways, thousands of stingrays are pulled from rivers each year simply to reduce the risk to bathers and ecotourists. And that removal goes completely unregulated because authorities do not classify it as fishing in the traditional sense. On top of all of that, hundreds of tons of freshwater stingrays are harvested for food every year in the Brazilian Amazon alone. These animals are, despite everything, a resource that communities depend on for survival. So here is what all of this adds up to. We have an animal that spent 50 million years evolving from a marine ancestor into a freshwater specialist. An animal whose venom surpasses its ocean relatives in both toxicity and delivery efficiency, whose camouflage makes accidental contact almost inevitable for anyone living or working along South American rivers, and whose sting causes tissue necrosis in the overwhelming majority of cases with no antivenom available anywhere in the world. Communities that know these rays best fear them more than piranhas. Collectors pay tens of thousands of dollars for a single specimen. Smugglers move them across borders in numbers that dwarf the legal trade. And the rivers they spent millions of years adapting to are being dammed, deforested, and dredged around them. The freshwater stingray is dangerous, that much is beyond question. But what makes it truly worth paying attention to is that even after decades of injuries, decades of research, and decades of trade, scientists are still uncovering basic facts about how its venom works. These are not animals we have figured out. They are animals we are still learning about, buried just beneath the sand of rivers that millions of people depend on every single day. Thank you for watching. If you found this one worth your time, consider subscribing to the Fishing Archive. We cover the species, the stories, and the science that most channels skip right over.